Based on your latest report, what would you say are the most pressing issues in each country of Central Asia, in all 5 republics, if you were to go country by country?
Okay. Well, let's start with the one that's the least talked about, Turkmenistan. I would say that the government, unfortunately, has a very successful clamp on information about what goes on inside the country. So freeing up information about the country would be number one in all spheres, not just human rights, but in general. For Kyrgyzstan, I would say there has been a proposed series of amendments to the religion law, proposed only by or mainly by the Committee on Religious Affairs, and everyone wonders whether it has the legal authority to do that. So far, these have been shelved, but I sincerely hope that they will not move forward on that. Kazakhstan used to be, as Kyrgyzstan, used to be very liberal. And until 2005, you didn't even have to register as a religious group. Now there are 4 tiers of required registration for a religious community. So if it were to go back to its previous position that you didn't have to register as a religious group, especially through this onerous process, that would be a very positive move. Tajikistan, I would say, not allowing religious activities for children would be a very important start, especially because Tajikistan, well, like other countries, Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan to some extent, have such fractured families because of the extensive labor migration of men. So therefore, letting children be more regular participants in social life, including, of course, religious life, would be a very important aspect. I mean, restrictions on children's participation in religious life is important throughout Central Asia. Unfortunately, it's been legalized, but it's particularly active and particularly, I want to use a Russian phrase, бросается в глаза, is particularly noticeable in Tajikistan. And then, of course, Uzbekistan, I would say that unfortunately my impression is, and I'm not a lawyer, so I certainly can't say this with any scientific certainty, that the 1998 religion law, in a sense, has served as the template for restrictions on religion throughout Central Asia and to some degree other parts of the former Soviet Union. So obviously extensive reform there, and then along with that, release of some of the many thousands of people who are imprisoned, mainly Muslims, in Uzbekistan for their nonviolent practice of independent Islam would be key elements.
So can we still say that Kyrgyzstan is perhaps the one which has more tolerance or more liberal laws on religion?
I would say its religion law has also represents a step backward from its, again, previous tolerant legal attitudes towards religion. The one area where it is noticeably more tolerant, officially speaking, all these societies are tolerant, it's the government policies towards religion that is intolerant, is the status of Jamaat Tabligh. It's still legal in Kyrgyzstan, and I hope it continues to be so, whereas it's banned as an extremist group throughout the other Central Asian countries. Partly, I think, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, that's one of its leading positions, unfortunately.
How do you collect the data that you use to compile this report? What is your research process like?
Well, partly we go to the countries, unfortunately not all that often, but so that's one aspect of our research methods. Another is reading extensively various kinds of reports on what goes on in the countries and government attitudes and laws. Another is, of course, talking to emigres and talking to human rights groups about what's going on there, and then talking also, of course, to U.S. government officials who are active in Central Asia as well.
And what kind of reactions, let's say feedback, you get from the countries that you're focusing on?
The human rights activists like our reports, and the governments don't generally. That would summarize it, I think, unfortunately.
And I know that you hold conversations with various government officials, diplomats here in Washington, various embassies, and you have also traveled to the region. So how do those conversations go?
Well, it depends, you know, I think really each country of Central Asia has its own form of diplomacy. And I would say Uzbekistan engages in the substance, and it knows, you know, its own situation from its own perspective, of course, fair enough, very well, and counters point by point the criticisms that we raise. At the same time, of course, unfortunately, it denies international specialists from the UN access to the country, and even the committee, the Red Cross committee that deals with prison conditions has not basically ceased working in Uzbekistan in 2013 because of its lack of cooperation from the government. So it varies a lot from country to country. Say Turkmenistan, it's usually silence. We have the president, Berdimuhamedov, invited us back. We did meet with him in 2007. He invited us back, and we've gotten visas, but the government always says it never has time to meet with us, just shortly before we're due to leave. We've tried several times since then, but we, you know, put a high priority on talking to government officials, since, you know, we want to understand their perspective, and also to try to convince them that basically we feel that the kinds of legal restrictions there are on religious activities across the board, basically, rather than combating religious extremism, it actually increases the chances of it arising, because people are so frustrated at the kinds of restrictions they have to labor under and live under.
You visited Uzbekistan, if I'm not mistaken, late in 2013.
Correct.
And you met with the former Mufti,
Yes.
Muhammad Yusuf
Yes.
Muhammad Sadiq,
Yes.
who recently passed away.
Yes.
And I know you've had conversations with him, and you probably saw how the country mourned his death.
Yes.
Thousands of people, floods of people
Yes.
on the streets.
Yes.
He obviously was probably the most notable religious figure of our time. How do you see his legacy?
Well, when we first met with him, when the commission went to Uzbekistan in 2004, we had a long meeting with him, and he showed us some of his books in Russian, and I recall one of them being Islam and Human Rights. When I met with him in October 2013, he was very gracious in agreeing to meet with me pretty much in the last minute, because I didn't know if I would have a visa until literally the day before I was due to leave from Kazakhstan, where I was visiting. And he, how can I say, he just embodied such gravitas, such wisdom about Islam. Not that I'm a specialist on Islam in any way, shape, or form, but you could feel his authority, and the kind of information that the government allows him to have on his website. And I don't know what's happened to that website. Perhaps
it is still
you
running.
Can, yeah.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And as I understand it, it highlights human rights problems not in Uzbekistan, but in other parts of the world, and discusses Islam from a theological perspective, and that's what people in former Soviet Central Asia are so curious about. They've been cut off from their majority tradition for generations, and it's natural that they're curious about their religion, and they should hear it from authoritative sources who are not put in a kind of a straitjacket by their governments.
We know that he openly advocated for religious education. He thought that religious education was the best way to fight extremism.
Yes.
Did he share those views with you too when you were there?
Yes, absolutely, yes. And I hope the embassy continues to have regular contacts with him. I wasn't, at the time that I met with him, I was under the impression that that was not so much the case. But of course, now, sadly, that's no longer possible. I don't know who will take his place. You know, the government has been so restrictive in allowing full and erudite acquaintance with Islamic tradition, even though in medieval times Uzbekistan was one of the leading centers for Islamic learning.
Well, the government could say that we still have many centers of Islam. We have University of Islam in Tashkent, and we have madrasas. We have thousands of mosques, and new ones are being built. And they could also say that, you know, recently, earlier this year, one of the most known religious prisoners, Khairullah Hamidov, was released. So they have a lot of arguments. When we talk to Uzbek officials, they're very critical of your reports and say that, well, you know, first of all, we really don't think that, you know, Washington should be criticizing us on religious freedom, because as they know very well, and as they should know, where, you know, most of these cases that they bring about are the cases of extremism, and these people that they refer as religious prisoners are actually criminals who wanted to overthrow the constitutional regime. So you know the arguments that they have against your commission. But releasing Khairullah Hamidov, amnestying him, do you look at that as a positive step?
I do. However, he also had to write a letter ask for pardon from the president. So at least in the Soviet system, and I imagine still in the Uzbek system, that is a tacit or explicit admission of guilt. And I don't think a reasonable person could say that he was guilty as charged. And I imagine he will then, if he's allowed to continue discussing Islam in the way, at least along the lines that he did before, he will run the risk of another sentence, unfortunately. I mean, it's very sad and really unnecessary. And as far as all these people being ordinary criminals who have violated Uzbek law, well, if the law were more reasonable and encouraged learning and encouraged independent thought, rather than trying to put everyone in the straitjacket of what the state considers feasible or legitimate, then there wouldn't be this problem. But according to, you know, reliable sources, there are many thousands of Uzbeks, mostly Muslims, imprisoned for the independent practice of Islam. Why is that a crime?
What do you think would take for your commission or organizations like yours and the governments in Central Asia to be on the same page when it comes to religious freedom, to sort of have a common understanding of what we are talking about when we say religious freedom? Because very often there is a lot of misunderstanding, because the governments can, you know, easily criticize you, saying that you're defending extremists, you're defending people who want to change our secular system.
Is it a secular system? I would say, on one hand, you know, there's some religions that are held up as more traditional for the Uzbek people than, or the peoples of Uzbekistan than others. And if that in fact is a secular state, I don't see how a secular state is supposed to be neutral on the question of religion, not, you know, say some religions are more traditional than others, say Sunni Islam being, and Hanafi schools specifically being more traditional than other schools. I mean, Ahmadi Islam is now illegal, if it ever was allowed in the first place. I know that's true in Kazakhstan. It's been made illegal there. So I would say that really the basis should be not the American model, but the international, the UN obligations. And all we're doing as a US government entity is calling on the government to live up to its international obligations, not to the American model of secularism, which I happen to think is a good one, but that's not the point.
Your reports are primarily submitted to the US Congress and to other government agencies, right?
Correct.
So, and there are countries of particular concern. Uzbekistan happens to be one for a while now, and you are recommending that Tajikistan should become a country should have the status of a country of a particular concern. What does it mean to be, let's say in short, CPC?
Right. Well, maybe I should explain, our role is purely an advisory role, so we don't make official government decisions. We advise mainly the State Department, since that's the executive body which oversees these areas. And of course Congress, as it plays a role in developing the laws that guide that process. So Uzbekistan was named to CPC back in 2006, of course in connection with the Andijan tragedy. So I think that's an important fact. We had been recommending for several years before that it be named that. Turkmenistan, for the first time in this most recent cycle, has also been named to CPC, and we have for several years recommended that Tajikistan also be named. That's mainly because of its very restrictive raft of laws. I've referred to the religious education of children, but of course there are many other restrictions. So we very much hope that in the next cycle Tajikistan will be named. But unfortunately, both in regard to Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, even though they were named CPCs by the State Department also after that signed special waivers to any sanctions being imposed as a result of these countries being named CPCs. So unfortunately, other US priorities take precedence over the fact that the CPC status has been given to those governments. I should stress it's governments, it's not the countries, because it's the governments that make the laws and apply the restrictions. And there's probably some grounds for concern, but whether that justifies the series of measures that have been taken years ago by the Central Asian governments to restrict religion, I think that's far from the case.
What are the main recommendations for the U.S. government? Of course, including the fact that CPC, as you say, should be taken seriously.
And sanctions considered, especially, say, in the case of Uzbekistan, against those officials who are specifically linked to the Andijan tragedy, massacre, whatever one wants to call it. And according to reliable sources, probably as many as 1,000 people have died during those events, and there's still over 200 people imprisoned for their alleged connection to these events, and of those 10 have died. So we continue to say that as a result of CPC, there should be a specific plan worked out with the Uzbek government so that the Uzbek government will take specific steps, including a transparent international investigation of the Andijan tragedy to find out what actually happened. And None of that seems to be forthcoming. Year after year, it's now been 10 years. And tragically, this is allowed to fester.
And other issues that U.S. should focus on in other parts of Central Asia?
Oh, absolutely. For example, in Kazakhstan, mosques which previously used to be specific to various traditionally Muslim groups, ethnic groups, they've been closed. And there's a considerable unification or homogenization, I guess I should say, of the kinds of mosques that are allowed to operate. And the control of the Council of Muftis has been, or the union, the official oversight body, Muslim oversight body, has been, considerably strengthened. And as I mentioned, in the case of Turkmenistan, the information crackdown is such that it's very hard to know what is actually going on. I should say that possibly as a result of the CPC designation, several Jehovah's Witnesses who were imprisoned as a result of their conscientious objection to military service have been released. So there has been a minor positive response, but we just don't know the dimensions of the other problems. And as the International Crisis Group observed several years ago, Turkmenistan has the highest, one of the world's highest ratios of imprisoned, people imprisoned in proportion to the numbers of the general population. And with Kyrgyzstan, I very much hope, as I mentioned before, that the religion law amendments, which would further worsen the religion law, will not be adopted. So I would say legal reform across the board is a really important issue.
So you're asking Washington to push for those reforms?
Absolutely.
And one of your recommendations also talks about us, the Voice of America,
yes.
and Radio Liberty,
yes.
and you are recommending that more content should be produced in the languages of Central
Absolutely.
Asia, right? How do you see, let's say, our impact, the effect of our reporting?
Well, I would say that precisely because the information, the attempt to control information is so dire in so many of these countries, the extent that you can get information through this, what is in effect an information blockade, especially on certain websites, is all to the good. And also, if we're so concerned, since we are so concerned with Afghanistan, there's a large Uzbek diaspora, there's a large Turkmen diaspora, and Tajik diaspora in Afghanistan. So it seems to me your resources should be increased rather than anything else. And furthermore, to the extent that you can provide discussion about Islam, discussion about world religion in general, that would be fantastic, because people's ignorance about issues that they care about and which are totally natural for them to be curious about is a very important issue and should be of greater interest to the U.S. government.
Well, thank you so much for talking to us.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it, and I hope some people in Uzbekistan and perhaps other countries can hear us.
They will. Thank you.